The preparation of Habitat 3, we had the opportunity to evaluate a little bit what has happened in urbanization in the last decades in order to see if there's a need to readdress the focus or the strategies of urbanization around the world. And I think that the answer to this question has been positive. Yes, there is a need to readdress the direction where urbanization is going in currently. Because urbanization, unfortunately, it's being driven by commercial reasons, aspects. The function of the real estate sector in general has been overemphasized, and at the other side, the urban governance has been decreasing or has been questioned in many parts of the world. And physical planning, urban design has been decaying and has been becoming something out of fashion in many parts of the world. And the outcome of all these questions has been a decrease of the quality of urban planning and design. It has been a diminishing of the provision of public space, which is a very dramatic aspect of urbanization. We have seen a huge proliferation of gated communities as an example of probably the most clear example of the failure of urbanization. Because when we are faced with the need to gate our neighborhoods, it means that something very fundamental is failing in the urban management or in the urban fabric or in the urban process. And therefore, I think that we need to recapitulate, we need to rethink very seriously where urbanization is going. And the Quito Papers provide some, quite a number of ideas that critically analyze what is going on, why, and how can we address it in the forthcoming decades. I think that one of the subjects that we had in our conversation in this process was the relevance of the modern movement that in the 30s of the last century came up with the Charter of Athens with a kind of set of ideas which defined the most contemporary and modern ideas at that moment. It was soon after the proliferation of the car as the new technology. The disruptive technology at that time was the car, but also it was after the social revolution in Russia and in other parts of the world, and also the emergency of new ideas approaching the social model of living together. Of course, it embraced a lot of progressive ideas about the right of the people to have a decent life and a decent housing. But the modern movement then immediately was challenged mainly by the Second World War, and after the Second World War the things were very different from what the 30s were, including the big financial crisis of 1929. And after the Second World War, something very different emerged, which picked some of the ideas of the modern movement, but forgetting quite a number of the rest of ideas. And the issues of the ideas like the tower in the park or the relevance of the car were totally embraced but equality of public housing for everybody was abandoned also with the same speed. And therefore, what came after the Second World War, it was a much more problematic urbanization model, which we tend to call it the international model, because it's a model that is repeated by the industry, mainly by the real estate industry, in a very similar manner in all of the cities of the world, irrespectively of culture, physical surroundings, or etc. If you are in the modern BCDs of the world, in many cases you will not have clues to distinguish, or you have not keys to distinguish where I am, in which city I am, because many of them, they look strictly similar because they are similar. They not just look similar. Unfortunately, they are similar. And therefore, it means that the quality and the quantity of information that urbanization transmits to the society is impoverished. It's falling down. Altogether, with the diminishing of the public space, it's generating a model of urbanization that is in crisis. And we are seeing very different symptomatic crises of these aspects of this crisis. For example, one of the last is the increase in inequalities in urbanization, the specialization, the functional specialization of neighborhoods, this neighborhood for the rich, this for the poor, this for the immigrants, this for public housing, this for recreational aspect, this commercial, this industrial, and this segregation of the functionality of the users of the land, it generates a huge demand of mobility, which is collapsing the cities. Because added to the increased demand of mobility, there's the design of the mobility. It's based in the big streets with a kind of motorway characteristic. And therefore all that it explains quite a number of the problems that cities are facing, both in the developed, but also, and in a special manner, in the developing world, where we usually face a very committed private sector to build and a very weak public sector to govern. And this is really a challenge that needs to be corrected, needs to be addressed, of course wisely, not in an authoritarian or in an inadequate manner, but needs to be addressed if we think, if we expect or we hope that urbanization is going to deliver the kind of goods that we associate historically to urbanization. Therefore, thank you to the colleagues for the Quito Papers, and let's hope that they introduce some kind of new light to the conversation that is taking a stance worldwide after the celebration of Habitat 3 and the approval of the new urban agenda. Thank you.
On behalf of the government of Ecuador, it is my pleasure to be present today, precisely when we observed the World Cities Days 2017. A couple of weeks ago, the international community also commemorated the first anniversary of the inauguration of the Habitat 3 conference in Quito, my city, located in Ecuador. The report by the UN Secretary General on Agenda Item 20, implementation of the outcomes of the United Nations conferences on human settlements and on housing and sustainable urban development, and strengthening of the United Nations Human Settlements Program, UN Habitat, highlighted figures that consolidated the legacy of one of the most successful United Nations conferences so far. We had over 30,000 representatives and individuals and 167 country delegations, constituting the largest participation of civil society, stakeholders, or local authorities in the history of the United Nations conferences. More than 50,000 people attended its 8 plenary meetings, 6 high-level roundtables, 4 assemblies, 10 policy dialogues, 22 special sessions, 3 urban talks, 59 UN events, 15 UN exhibitions, 42 Habitat 3 village projects, 2018 side events, and 144 exhibition booths. Its main outcome, the intergovernmentally agreed New Urban Agenda, has been translated into the 6 UN official languages, and also to Albanian, Czech, German, Indonesian, Malaysian, and Portuguese, and consistent with its inclusivity inception, Braille and audio versions will be available as well. Perhaps the most important feature was the Habitat 3, with the background of the city of Quito, the first city declared World Cultural Heritage Site by UNESCO in 1978, constituted a perfect venue to gather together national, regional, subnational, and local governments with all relevant stakeholders as policy developers rather than only implementers, living true with its commitment to achieve an inclusive, sustainable urban development for all, with the overarching theme of leaving no one behind, is consolidated in the urban setting. We reaffirm that the policy leadership of the national government and the participation of all relevant stakeholders are fundamental to achieve this common purpose with the support of the United Nations Development System, UN Habitat, and other related special agencies. In this regard, the government of Ecuador, recognizing the housing and sustainable urban development have a major role for our citizens and inhabitants alike to achieve sustainable development, and along the spirit of the new urban agenda, has launched the national plan, A House for All, which aims to build, according to technical specifications, 325,000 homes within the next 4 years, in order to address the housing deficit. 60% of these houses will be handed free of charge to low-income and vulnerable families, and for the remaining 40%, a financing plan with very reasonable installments on the term is contemplated. Now is the time to act. We all must join forces for the implementation and monitoring of the new urban agenda, strengthening inclusiveness and banishing segregation in the urban and rural space through a change in the urban paradigm based on the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. In this regard, Ecuador highlights the importance of the progressive recognition of the right of the city. Ecuador also restates the proposal by Mr. John Claus on the convenience for local authorities to adopt the new urban agenda in their parliaments as the political guide for their future work. Without the active participation of local governments and civil society, national governments will be not able to fulfill the objectives of this agenda. For the government of Ecuador and the people of Ecuador, it was a true honor to host Habitat 3, and we all look forward to welcoming you again in our country. After this work, we're going to see a short film about the Quito Papers towards the open city, and then we're going to finally enjoy the conversation between Michael Kimmelman, the architectural critic of the New York Times, contributing authors Richard Sennett, Saskia Sassen, and urbanist Eugene Birch. Thank you very much for your presence, and enjoy the afternoon.
definition of the city that I like most is the definition that says the city is the place where you find what you are not looking for.
The city is a complex but incomplete space.
The thing that distinguishes a city from just a place which has got lots of people living close together is that those different groups interact.
Most people making decisions in cities don't get it. So I think we've got a long way to go in terms of bringing a whole new field that understands the social processes and the physical process at the same time. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The presentation tonight really touches, as you can see, on three massive themes of importance for Habitat 3, which is how do you actually design cities in the wider sense of the word, not just physical design, but governance, and also how does one relate to environmental, ecological, social, and economic issues.
Hablar de la ciudad hoy no es solamente hablar de la ciudad, es hablar de una pérdida masiva de hábitat.
El futuro no está predeterminado. No estamos castigados a tener mala ciudad de una forma determinística.
2.5 years ago, one close and I were having a drink, and I asked him, have you read the Charter of Athens? This enormously influential document.
To explain the Charter of Athens, which was more or less conceived in 1933 on a great ship going across the Mediterranean, you've got to probably go back a little bit more to understand context. The early part of the 20th century was thought of as the machine age. New forms of production were coming into process, affecting everyone's lives. The car was beginning to dominate the way we moved around in cities and in the world.
They had a dream, and that dream was that a city could be organized to work like a beautiful machine.
We want to remember that then, in the 1930s, the city was seen as overcrowded, dark, and actually negative in terms of well-being. So if you believe in the machine age, if you believe in rationalist principles, what do? You clean it up. And you do that by taking all the different functions and separating them out. You put people to sleep there, you put people to work there, you go and entertain yourself there. You connect them by nice motorways with cars. That's a view of what Le Corbusier imagined for Paris. Making the city as a machine, putting people in towers, and having a cruciform shape so that you could get fresh air and improve the health of the people there. What was actually ruined in that process was the street, was the continuity and the sense of cohesion.
The problems today that we have in urbanism is that we design cities to be closed in the sense that there's a tight bond between form and function and how people experience the city.
I would say that most of the principles of the 30s Charter are still quite dominant. The notion that there's a CBD somewhere, central business district, then out there are towers of housing, or linked by large freeways and motorways. Those more or less are the principles of the Charter of Athens from 70 years ago. Even though arguments about sustainability, arguments about social cohesion, arguments about integration really should be taking the city in the opposite direction.
Confronted with some of these trends, I like to ask, who owns the city? In the city, those without power can stand up and say, we're present, and this is also our city. That is, to me, what marks the city, and that is why mere built-up density is not a city, and we need to protect that distinction.
Space has to bring people together. There has to be fizz of interaction.
Once we accept that in the city, to have a decent life, we require a lot of commons. The public land ends up being something between 60 or 70% of the total land of the city, which is very counterintuitive to the ones that I think that the market is governing urbanization. What governs the quality of good urban life is the provision of public land.
The beginning of creating an open city is to protect the public realm as something that belongs to the public, to resist the privatization of public space. Most of the public space in most cities is streets. It's a common good. Under kind of neoliberal capitalism, we've lost the notion that the public belongs to the public.
The last 30 years, what we see is the rise of logics of extraction, away from the dominance of mass consumption, which meant that even the most aggressive corporation or bank was interested in the sons and daughters of the middle classes doing better than their parents. When you switch to the dominance of a logic of extraction, none of that matters.
It's very difficult for the private owner to understand that the provision of public space is fundamental and in fact generates private value. The market is not a good urban plan.
When you see that the dominant logic is a logic of extraction, that means concentration, concentration, concentration. So this particular period has generated its own undoing, because in the end, keep extracting, there's not much left.
Something that simply can be reduced to profit laws.
The Charter of Athens model is of great interest to the private sector in terms of promoting land investment or speculation It's a very easy way to deal with cities, rather than this messy, organic, integrated way that we might find in pre-existing cities that have been there a long time and require much more negotiation. Expansion of cities is important as long as they're well planned. Well planned doesn't mean making an instant perfect city. It means providing the infrastructure of a messy and incremental city. Unless you get the physical infrastructure right, you don't get the potential for equity right.
The question of the equitable city is a difficult one. How can we make an intervention that alters the dominance of this logic of extraction? So for me, one of them is the importance of relocalizing pieces of the economy that today are basically exist as elements of franchises. So my rhetorical question there is always, do we really need a multinational corporation to have a cup of coffee? We need to find a way that whatever the consumption capacity of these modest neighborhoods, which is most of the neighborhoods in the world, whatever it is, we should maximize its recirculation.
This permanent effort to make the city a just place, where every innovation is not owned by a minority and denied to the rest, or used by a minority to make more money.
There are lots of things we can do to bring an open city into being, to overlay different kinds of functions in the city so that they synergize.
The political class, they need to enable a better distribution of the wealth that is getting produced. Because the mechanisms that lead to concentration at the top, we made those mechanisms. They did not fall from the sky. We altered the law. Those were critical decisions that were made in legislatures, that were made by the executive branch, that were made by judges, that were made, in a variety of settings. That needs to be changed.
Going in the opposite direction from the Charter of Athens actually means understanding what density, complexity, and overlapping of different functions, so that you have something happening in the city at different times of day and night for different people, the open city. Not a closed, walled place where people of difference can't come together.
The open city is based on the notion that an environment becomes more and more complex. And how do you manage it rather than try and simplify it?
There are three basic concepts behind this. One is, as Richard Sennett calls it, the openness of the city. How open can you make the city? In other words, not close it down for different, distinct groups who never mix. The second is Saskia Sassen's argument, which is about ownership. Who owns the city? How do we actually give it back to different constituents and not give in to what is now the trend in many cities around the world of large companies, corporations taking over major chunks. And thirdly is, I guess, my contribution to the discussion, which is that design really matters. It's not just a question of planning, it's not just a question of zoning and regulations, it's the quality, it's the section of the street, how wide is the street, how tall are the buildings.
The reason for opening up the city is ultimately that this is how you keep a place alive.
Commission Sennett, additional film.
Jeannie Birch, University of Pennsylvania. Saskia Sassen, Columbia University.
So, Richard, let me begin with you. How did this project come to being, the Quito Papers?
As I indicated in the film, it started very informally with a discussion with Juan Close and other people in UN Habitat about why this document, this Charter of Athens, was so overwhelming to the imagination of planners today. And the conjunction of that question led to the feeling that, well, we should just do something about it that is verbal, and we should also make a film about that and show what could be different. And in that regard, I would like to thank the filmmaker, and you should stand. This is Dominic Ragnavo. This is his film. And what the film attempted to do was show what has been lost in the process of following this model. We then put together a research team, thanks to UN Habitat, and the results of that research into the open city will be published later this month, we hope, by Routledge. There are a series of academic papers which are oriented to this non-academic issue of how can we reimagine the city beyond this functionalist, closed, tight fits between form and function. How can we open up the city? And they're papers for you. They're not for academic specialists, although they employ a lot of academic research. And then the next step was thinking of where could we go that would be a place that would embody this tension, and that took us to Quito, which is both a very forward-looking city, but a city that has been encumbered by some of the planning assumptions made in the 20th century. So that's the shape of this project.
Jeannie, what's the importance of a book like this?
Well, we had a very instructive movie film from Juan Close, where he took us through the 20th century and why the Charter of Athens was important. We're now in the 21st century. We now have a legacy of a phenomenal conference that just occurred in the city of Quito. We have new thinking. We have new things that are happening in our world. Technologies have changed. The way people work have changed. Our view of who should own the city has changed. Our view of what the open city has changed. Our view of what works in urban design has changed. Why are we reading these old things? Why aren't we creating for the future the legacy of what the thinking is? And so that's the importance of this book. This is very important landmark of the conference, Habitat 3, and landmark of the 21st century thinking about what we ought to be thinking about as we build the 60% of the world that is yet to be built as we urbanize.
So, Saskia, okay, so let's sum up for a second. The large trends of the 21st century. We have massive urbanization taking very different forms in the global south and in places like New York City or London. You have rural desertification driven by political conflicts, by climate change. You have huge conflicts over accessibility to water. And much of this is driving urban growth. Massive informality as a consequence, at the same time, as Dr. Close said, the proliferation of gated communities. So these are giant issues. And what came up in some of these conversations, and has repeatedly come up, conversations I've had with you over the years, what is the nature of public space? What is the nature of a city that separates it, as you said, Richard, from just an agglomeration of people? I was struck, as many of you here may remember, the Occupy movement some years ago, which took over squares, some of them incidentally privately owned spaces.
Where they could stay the whole night, whereas in the public they could not.
Exactly.
Those are little ironies.
Absolutely right. But many of these protests took the form of model cities, kind of template of a polis, a place where people felt they could demonstrate all the different functions of a community in a physical space. I thought that was quite interesting. The way in which public space manifests a notion of a more democratic urban spot.
The commons.
A commons, exactly. So I give this little speech because at the heart of a lot of what has come up here, and I think is in the Quito Papers, is the presumption that we should strive for equity, that that privatization is inherently problematic, that the model of urbanization that grew out of the automobile and the not just Athens, but a whole 20th century idea of what was progress is outmoded. Fair enough. But this is not actually the way cities are growing. And it's not enough, obviously, to say people should not just acquiesce to privatization. There has to be some driving and often economic model for why we should have a more equitable city, why private interests should not have free reign, or what might serve those private interests. So, forgive the long speech, but I want to move through repeating the kinds of things which I think we all agree on, and look towards what solutions might be.